90% of America's fresh tomatoes once arrived from Mexico, a steady flow totaling over $3 billion each year, slipping quietly across the border with every truck and train. But that economic current was abruptly dammed on July 14, 2025. Without so much as a public debate or a hint of transition, the U.S. government imposed a sudden 17% tariff on every imported tomato. There were no floor speeches, no flickers of controversy on cable news, just a terse announcement and a wall of silence. In the following weeks, the effects radiated through cities and towns with a swiftness that stunned not just grocers and consumers, but a nation long lulled by cheap, plentiful produce. In Raleigh, North Carolina, tomato prices rocketed over 40% in a matter of weeks. The shock in store aisles was palpable. A mother paused mid-shop, picking up a tomato then putting it back, the luxury too much to justify. At local restaurants, salsa became a memory, erased from menus overnight. School cafeterias watched their salads lose color and variety, students noticing the absence of the familiar red. Across the country, shoppers found themselves asking, quietly and collectively, what just happened? This wasn't about farming, it wasn't about notions of fairness or the rituals of international negotiation. This was a rupture, a pointed message delivered not with words but with cold economic force. Overnight, the tomato was transformed from a kitchen staple into a political statement. July 14th marked more than just a policy shift. It was the day the U.S. officially terminated the 2019 tomato suspension agreement with Mexico, a hard-won trade accord credited for years with stabilizing prices and ensuring a reliable supply. That deal had acted as a kind of pressure valve, soothing disputes before they could escalate and ensuring that commerce, not conflict, governed agricultural trade. This time, however, there was no negotiation, no roundtables or special working groups assembled. There was only a press release and a stunning new reality, a 17% tariff, effective immediately. The swiftness reverberated all the way to the loading docks. Tomatoes already on trucks, already on the road to the supermarkets of America, were taxed the instant they crossed the border. Importers called it a blindside. Economists used words like reckless. Grocers simply called it a crisis. In as little as 2 months, tomato prices in major American cities shot up anywhere from 30% to 45%. A pound of beefsteak tomatoes in Raleigh leaped from $2.99 to $4.35. In Los Angeles, Roma tomatoes, once a budget staple at under $1, now surpassed $3.80. For working families, this wasn't mere inflation. It was a new razor edge slicing through already stretched budgets. School cafeterias, always sensitive to changes on the supply side, began pulling tomatoes out of salads. Fast food chains, under rising cost pressures, swapped out fresh salsa for cheaper processed substitutes. In American kitchens, tomato sauce was thinned and stretched. One more meal forced to last just a little longer. But the damage ran far deeper than mere shopping lists. In Florida, the impact was existential. Dozens of small, often Latino-owned import businesses shuttered in a matter of weeks, unable to absorb the sudden price shocks. Each closed storefront, each eliminated delivery route spelled lost jobs. Hundreds of warehouse staff, drivers, and farm liaisons left adrift. Many of these workers had spent decades forging the delicate bridges between U.S. demand and Mexican supply, only to find themselves overnight written out of the equation. There were no government statements offering support, no transition funds, simply locked gates and severance envelopes hand-delivered without explanation. Trade experts across the nation expressed disbelief. No one had expected disagreements to remain under wraps forever, but few imagined a 17% tariff would be dropped like a guillotine, with no warning and no hearings. By the end of July, market analysts warned that the collapse in tomato imports threatened to ripple outward, dragging down packaging, refrigeration, and transportation firms, a supply chain domino effect that could drive up the price of food across the board. For the public, Washington offered a simple rationale. This was about protecting American farmers. But a closer look revealed fissures in that defense. For most of the year, Florida's tomato fields lay fallow. In states like New York, Illinois, and Minnesota, grocery shelves depended almost exclusively on imports. Meanwhile, California, a once mighty tomato producer, had faced a decade of shrinkage, battered by drought and labor shortages. So as receipts lengthened and paychecks shrank, the central question only grew louder. Was this really about farming, or was it in the end about politics? As the dust settled from the abrupt tariff imposition, Mexico responded not with fury, but with strategic precision. While Washington was fixated on the politics at home, Mexican engineers, logisticians, and trade experts quietly began charting a new course. Literally. They plunged into innovation, reshaping supply chains to sidestep the tariffs that had suddenly choked their access to the U.S. market. Within just 3 months, a remarkable new rail corridor emerged, carving a path far from the American border. This wasn't a rash pivot, but a meticulously engineered solution. Trains now transport fresh tomatoes, berries, and peppers from Mexico's agricultural heartland in Bayo through northern Chihuahua, then east through Mexico into Canada's provinces of Ontario and Quebec. This cold chain corridor is a marvel of logistics, featuring refrigerated, insulated, and sensor-controlled containers that maintain produce at an exact 1 degree C to +1 degree, preserving freshness over a 2,000-kilometer journey. The benefits were immediate and measurable: 4 to 5 extra days of shelf life, reduced waste, fewer rejected shipments, and significantly cheaper transportation costs. Significantly, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, the rail operator, reported that this route slashed logistics expenses by around 15% compared to traditional trucking through U.S. distribution hubs. In effect, while the U.S. government was busy taxing tomatoes, Mexico was optimizing their journey north. At first, this seemed like a temporary workaround, a stopgap until tariffs might be repealed, but in truth, it was much more: a permanent reorientation. Great Canadian supermarket chains, notably Loblaws and Metro, didn't just inspect Mexican farms, they signed 5-year contracts. These long-term deals cemented Mexico's new trade ties north of the U.S. border, sending a clear message. Mexico wasn't planning a return to old roots. Notably, Mexico made no headlines, no theatrical denouncements or fiery speeches from their trade ministry or president. Instead, railcars filled with fresh produce silently rolled across new terrain. A senior trade advisor in Ottawa encapsulated this with stark clarity. They didn't fight the tariff, they outgrew it. For U.S. officials, the sting of this silent rerouting was profound. The shift hadn't merely moved tomatoes, it moved trust. Buyers that once funneled produce through Texas distribution hubs began investing heavily in cold storage infrastructure in Montreal and Toronto. American ports from California to Arizona began seeing diminished volume and fewer contracts. Farmers, retailers, and consumers in the U.S. watched these trains pass by, not with outrage, but with bewilderment. The tunnel beneath the tariff wall wasn't just a metaphor, it was becoming permanent. Bloomberg Green projected that by 2026, Canada would receive nearly 48% of Mexico's fresh tomato exports, up from less than 1% a mere 2 years prior. And this wasn't a phenomenon limited to tomatoes. Strawberries, avocados, bell peppers were also increasingly rerouted northward. No speeches, just signatures, no protest, only contracts. Canada, meanwhile, embraced this shift gracefully. Executives from Canada's top grocers did not travel to Mexico for photo ops, they went for farm tours, soil assessments, and taste tests, securing supply chains that politics in Washington seemed eager to disrupt. A logistics director from Metro put it plainly, "We don't sign deals based on election cycles." That phrase underscored what Mexico and Canada had recognized together: stability outvalues politics. The economic consequences for U.S. buyers and consumers were stark. Supply chain analytics firm A-Tools reported that wholesale prices for imported tomatoes in the U.S. surged 22% in July 2025, with retailers blaming a toxic mix of tariffs, inspection delays, and erratic federal enforcement. A Florida produce manager compared the situation to playing roulette with perishables, where every shipment's fate was uncertain. Meanwhile, across the border in Windsor, Ontario, a new refrigerated storage facility opened, fully staffed and booked through the first quarter of 2026. Importers and warehouse operators from Buffalo to El Paso were shutting doors as their business dwindled. This wasn't just economics, it was personal. Maria, a single mother from New Jersey, once bought a pound of tomatoes every Sunday. Now, faced with new prices nearing $4 per pound, she chooses canned beans, cheaper, saltier, longer lasting. Her 5-year-old son doesn't notice, but the nutritional cost lingers. Tom, a retired welder in Laredo, Texas, told reporters the produce aisle felt like a luxury store he could no longer afford. In Detroit, the Wilson family, relying on SNAP benefits, cut tomatoes, avocados, and peppers from their weekly grocery lists. "We haven't had a fresh salad in 3 weeks," the mother said, "just coleslaw and potatoes." Schools felt the impact too. In Champaign County, Illinois, a public elementary school replaced tomato wedges in lunch trays with pre-packed shredded lettuce. A teacher lamented that children noticed the difference, their plates literally losing color, as policy failure seeped into everyday life. This was no accident, it was policy, and it landed harder than anyone had predicted, not in legislative chambers, but in homes and schools across the country. Critics argue the tariff was intended to protect American farmers, but those farmers face long-term challenges from climate change, drought, and labor shortages, not sudden trade shocks. Instead of support, they received headlines. Meanwhile, consumers, the true caught in the middle, paid the price in grocery bills and nutrition. What began in produce aisles was already echoing far beyond. By late July 2025, logistics firms in Europe's Rotterdam and Hamburg ports began rethinking routes, favoring direct shipments from Brazil to Europe, bypassing U.S. ports entirely. Brazil quickly signed a 5-year deal with the Netherlands to supply organic vegetables directly through Portuguese ports, avoiding American intermediaries and their unpredictable policy swings. Colombia and Peru shifted exports northward to Canadian ports like Vancouver and Halifax, rather than U.S. gateways in Los Angeles and Houston. In Asia, delegations from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan didn't visit Washington. Instead, they toured Mexico's export hubs to learn how Mexico rebuilt its trade model without relying on the U.S. A Korean trade advisor reportedly labeled Mexico a model of resilience. Japanese and German firms began eyeing Mexican electronics export hubs as springboards into Asia, bypassing U.S. trade agreements entirely. Back in Canada, officials anticipated the trend. In late September, Agricorp Ontario began piloting dual-language packaging lines labeling Mexican tomatoes as products of Canada under USMCA rules, an astute legal and logistical tactic that was both seamless and politically irrefutable. If the U.S. wants chaos, one Canadian official remarked, we'll offer certainty. Because this was more than fruit or tariffs. It was about reliability, trust, and the complex web of international commerce. European central bank analysts warned of a creeping strategic shift in global trade lanes, away from US-centric routes. What started with tomatoes could spread to autos, semiconductors, biotech, industries integral to America's economic future. Mexico didn't stage a boycott, they simply outmaneuvered. Canada didn't push, they opened their doors. Meanwhile, American consumers paid more for less, still assured this was how you protect farmers. But maybe, just maybe, it's no longer about tomatoes. Maybe this tariff marks the first fissure in America's broader trade architecture, the start of a global unraveling where political brinkmanship costs the very people it claims to defend. The reverberations of the tomato tariff continue to unfold, exposing a deeper transformation in how global trade is conducted and how nations strategize their economic futures. The story that began with a sudden tax on Mexican tomatoes now serves as a cautionary tale about political short-sightedness and the power of adaptive resilience in international markets. In the months following the tariff, the American agricultural and retail sectors found themselves grappling with an evolving landscape. Retailers struggled to anticipate supply shortages and price fluctuations, forcing many to recalibrate menus and inventory. Consumers tightened budgets, opting for less fresh produce and sometimes foregoing nutrition altogether. Maria's story, Tom's quiet resignation, and the Wilson family's truncated fresh food options became emblematic of a larger cultural and economic shift, a subtle erosion of access to affordable, quality food that disproportionately affected working families and vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, Mexico's quiet recalibration of its supply chains sent shockwaves that extended well beyond North America. Countries across Europe and Asia began to observe and emulate Mexico's ability to bypass traditional trade routes centered on the United States. European ports in Rotterdam and Hamburg saw steady declines in shipments routed through American pathways as Brazilian exporters realigned with Dutch ports and Portuguese gateways under new bilateral agreements. The implications of these shifts transcended agriculture, hinting at the vulnerability of US-centric logistics and the risk of diminished influence in the global supply network. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan's trade delegations, instead of focusing on Washington, prioritized exploring Mexico's burgeoning export hubs, assessing not only agricultural shipments but also manufacturing and technology corridors that could serve as alternatives to US trade dominance. This strategic move underscored a growing skepticism toward American policy stability and an eagerness among international partners to diversify supply chains. Canada's role as a trade sanctuary has been equally transformative. by fostering long-term contracts and investing in infrastructure that supports seamless tariff-free trade under existing agreements like USMCA, Canadian retailers and policymakers showed that stability can be an asset more potent than aggressive protectionism. Dual-language packaging initiatives and the legal relabeling of Mexican produce as Canadian exemplify a savvy approach to circumventing disruption without breaching trade rules. Amidst this shifting panorama, experts warn that the consequences for U.S. competitiveness could be profound. Strategic supply chains for semiconductors, automotive parts, and medical supplies may begin to follow similar patterns, relocating through corridors that offer predictability and cooperation over volatility and unilateral action. The gradual erosion of America's centrality in global trade networks represents not just an economic challenge, but a geopolitical one, with rival nations capitalizing on fractures caused by domestic policy missteps. Politically, the sudden tariff raises pressing questions about governance and foresight. The lack of consultation, absence of transition measures, and disregard for the broad impact exemplify a policy approach ill-suited for an interconnected economy, deeply dependent on seamless cross-border collaboration. Critics contend that while protecting domestic farmers is a valid goal, it requires nuanced strategies that balance national interests with the realities of a global supply chain, not blunt tariffs that alienate partners and provoke lasting shifts. For American consumers, the practical implications are clear: rising grocery bills, diminished food variety, and a growing disconnect between political rhetoric and daily life. The tomato tariff may have been a high-profile spark, but the flame it ignited illuminates vulnerabilities transcending produce aisles, from hearts and dinner tables across the country to cargo containers and rail yards around the world. As policymakers await the next chapter, the question remains: will the United States find a path back to cooperative, stable trade policies that serve both farmers and consumers? Or will the ripple effects of this tariff culminate in a broader unraveling, where political showmanship costs more than just tomatoes, threatening the very fabric of American economic leadership? In the end, the humble tomato has become a symbol of larger truths about trade, trust, and the imperative of foresight in governance. A lesson has been delivered quietly but unmistakably. When nations choose political battles over partnership, it is the everyday people who pay the steepest price. If this story resonates with you, consider supporting independent journalism that digs deeper into the policies shaping your life and livelihood. Your engagement helps bring these unseen economic shifts into the light, ensuring that the next policy surprise doesn't catch you off guard.